one of your broadcasts, you claim that the story of Paul's martyrdom is a fabrication of the church, but why do you dismiss the testimonies of early Christian writers like Clement of Rome and Ignatius of Antioch, both of whom attest to his martyrdom? What makes their testimony less valued than the Talmud?
That's a very good question. I'm very grateful that you asked it, and I want to tease this out. We have to find the definition of martyrdom and how Christians use that term. You chose Paul, and I'm going to go with that. So I want to be very clear what martyrdom means. Like Joseph Smith was killed for his religion. I mean, if he had not claimed to be a prophet, he wouldn't have died that way. Is Joseph Smith a martyr? If he is, and that's considered a good thing, then why don't you become Mormons? Okay, so this is not the way the church is using it, and I want to be very clear in how the argument that Christians make when they say that Paul was a martyr, or Paul and Peter were martyrs, or almost all disciples were martyrs, with the exception of John. We have to be very clear on what that means, because no one questions that there were Christians who were killed because they were Christians. And there is no religion on this planet that does not have people that died for their religion. Okay? So that's not what we mean here. We have to have a definition term. So I'm going to define the term martyr in this way. That doesn't mean the word only means that, but this is how Christians weaponize and use this term with regard to Paul or Peter, and then I'm going to address this. A martyr in this context would mean someone who witnessed Jesus' resurrection, or in the case of Paul claims to have had a special revelation from Jesus, not at the time of the crucifixion and supposed resurrection, but his own personal encounter with Jesus. Now, the claim goes on to say that these people were offered to go free and live, or they would have to die. Okay? So this is very important, because the argument is, why would a person die for a lie? Okay. If you don't get this part, you're not going to get any of it. So Christians argue that why would Paul be willing to die? Why would Peter be willing to be crucified upside down if he never saw the resurrection and he was lying? Because anyone, if they're lying, this is why people accept from the prosecutor a deal, because they basically want to lessen their sentence. I mean, if someone was a liar, why would they die for a lie? Liars make poor martyrs, okay? So what Christians are saying is Peter, Paul, and others were set to be executed, but we're told that if they recant what they're saying, then they go free, okay? And then the third part of that definition is that they chose to die rather than renounce their religious beliefs, okay? So that's used as an argument for why we should trust them, okay? Do you understand that? Okay, so this is all nonsense. There is nothing you chose 2 Clement of Rome, probably written at the end of the 1st century. There are some that argue it's later than that. And Ignatius makes that claim, supposedly makes that claim, but they don't make that claim. Those two make the claim that Paul died, It doesn't say that they were given this option. Now, I want to be very clear that I do not believe that this letter of Ignatius and many other letters attributed to this early church father, who was the bishop of Antioch, are authentic. It's very clear. I think the vast majority of scholars do not believe Ignatius's letters that are attributed to him are authentic. They're rather fake. But I want to grant everything because I want to steelman this. They don't make that claim. moreover, if Paul was offered to live, if he just recants his claim and chose to die, why didn't they say that? Now, Irenaeus, for instance, in his work against heresies in chapter 3, just says that what I believe happened is that Paul went to Rome, wasn't executed, and moved on to Spain. And in the book of Romans, Paul says that he's, after Rome, he's going on to Spain. And in fact, if you look at Clement 5, the Clement of Rome, chapter 5, where this comment comes from, the author says that he died in the westernmost part, in the furthest in the west, which would be Spain, right? So he's in Rome. If you go west of Rome, it's Spain. So Clement is not even claiming that Paul was executed in Rome. So this is and this incidentally comports with Irenaeus's account against heresies, section 3, that Paul in fact departed. But I want to, so do you get all that? So now the claims that we hear about in the church that Paul's head was chopped off, when his head was chopped off, milk sprang out of his neck, and then his head bounced 3 times, and every time his head bounced, a spring of water shot out of the ground. And there's actually a church in Rome which has the fountains there and all that stuff. They call, I think, the church outside the wall in Rome. There, you want to believe that, you can believe it. But that's all late church fiction, mythology. And it's very, very late. You want to read that kind of stuff, you go to late books like the Acts of Peter, the Acts of Paul. That's where you find it. But there's actually something here that's really quite remarkable, and that is we can look at the Christian canon and see that's not the case. The book of Acts is very important to us. The book is called the Acts of the Apostles, but although it's called the Acts of the Apostles, in reality, the book really is, the last 2/3 of the book is about Paul, okay? And Paul essentially ascends to, he's a good guy, he's the great guy, and basically once he converts to Christianity, he is perfect, unlike Peter, who makes mistakes. But Paul is just right on. Now, the key is the dating for the book of Acts conservatively means if any of you opened a Christian Bible, I don't care what Christian Bible you use, and look for the date of the book of Acts, the dating, I'm being very conservative here, I'm being very charitable here, is 8590. Okay, there are scholars who place it in the 2nd century. I'm not doing that. Okay, now the claim is that Paul was killed under Nero, which means he was killed in the 60s. He was executed in the 60s. So now, just so those of you who are not familiar with the book of Acts, it ends with Paul being released from prison. Okay, Paul is released from jail. Okay. So this is what you'd have to believe. The book of Acts written, let's just be very charitable, because we want to steelman this, was written 20 years after Paul was executed. And whoever wrote the book of Acts wrote the book of Luke. We don't know who it is, written anonymously, but whoever wrote it just did not think that Paul being executed willingly for his faith was important enough to mention. And this is completely impossible to believe, and this is not proving from silence. It's just not possible. Acts would have recorded that. After all, the book of Acts and Luke Acts is very interested in martyrdom and how you're supposed to die as a martyr. In fact, we find the death of Stephen earlier on in the book of Acts. So whoever wrote Luke Acts was very interested in dying for your religion. We have in Luke Acts, James, the brother of John, the son of Zebedee, he gets killed in prison. Now, he didn't willingly die for his religion. I'm surprised you don't ask that. But it doesn't say that he was offered. So it only is, the way it's set up, the way Christians are going to try to convert you to Christianity, say, look, these people will offer the option of walking away and surviving and living, or you're going to die. And they chose to die rather than walk away. So that would be interesting. That would be, it wouldn't convince me to be a Christian. Maybe they were self-deluded. There are many people who, are deluded and believe that some Hindu god appeared to them. But you at least are making the case. But then what happens is we're told, this huge claim is made, and we go, well, where's the evidence? And the evidence isn't there. It isn't in Clement of Rome. It's not there. It doesn't say they were offered this. The end of the book of John also seems to imply that Peter is taken against his will one day, so it might imply that Peter would die, but against his will, not that he would have the choice. And the book of Acts is clear that Paul didn't die for his religion, because why are we not told that? Why are we just told that he was freed from prison? Ignatius, which I don't think is authentic at all, but Ignatius doesn't say that Paul was offered one or the other and chose to die rather than to live. So be very careful with the word martyrs, because what does that mean? That people were killed for their religion? That's entirely possible. That we could be certain that Christians were executed by Nero because of what Tacitus says in the 2nd century. We can be fairly confident of that. But they willingly died rather than just renounce it. That's really a very silly argument, and it's based on much, much later mythology that emerges from the church centuries after the supposed event. Thank you for your question.